All right. Well, thank you all for joining this session, and we look forward to great presentations and a great discussion. So let's go ahead and get started. First, there are two ways to think about private sector engagement in DRR. And you can, yeah, that's okay. The first is who we are and the nature of the work that we do. And the second is how we apply approaches, engagement, and thinking in the work that we do. So for the former, since we're focusing on the latter for this discussion, it's really important to note that we are a purpose-driven company that provides this expertise that really sustains industries as we talk about and safeguards communities around the world. So underpinning that is that we believe that firms can and should have a positive impact on society. And we believe that we are uniquely positioned to use our deep engineering and DRR and management expertise capabilities for global good. We also believe that a powerful way to address complex issues is to integrate social impact into the core of our work, and we benefit social need as we're doing business. So it's really important to say that, as a private sector actor in the international development and humanitarian assistance space, we're already providing great leadership just by the virtue of who we are and the work that we're doing. And that's really important to recognize. Next slide, please. So now on to the topic of the engagement of private sector globally in our programs. So as many of you know, private sector actors are increasingly viewed in international development and humanitarian assistance circles as strategic partners, as well as looking to their infrastructure and other assets as a potential source for, in the disaster context, temporary emergency accommodation and or assistance where they could locate and provide goods and services post-disaster. Businesses also have a critical role in supporting resilient livelihoods, both pre and post-disaster, given the unique relationship that private sector actors have with their own staff, customers, and suppliers, as well as the government. So in our programming, as you will hear from the panel today, there are a variety of ways that we show private sector engagement in our programs and how it's critical to local ownership and the sustainability of our programming. So let me just frame a little bit across the donor landscape. The priorities and definition of private sector engagement really varies. However, in the context of DRR and preparedness, it's tended to cluster along the following areas. So the first is sharing information to really foster discoveries and innovations. And here we can look to our own programming examples, how we've done the seismic risk assessments and prepare, some of the hazard and vulnerability data collection, the engagement of professional associations, universities and research institutes, chambers of commerce and business associations, as we have in Trinidad and Tobago. So this is all about how do we work together to kind of foster those discoveries and innovations. The second is to develop standards and promote common practices. So again, some examples of how we've done that is the way in which we've approached the rapid damage assessments, tools and protocol development, joint training, action planning, again, engaging professional associations. In Haiti, the earthquake and hurricane response preparedness program had a large private sector component as well. In Ecuador, engaging universities and other players. So this is all along that lines of developing the standards and promoting common practices. The third is the use of public and private multi-stakeholder engagement to influence development outcomes. And I know we just had a session on multi-stakeholder engagement, but there again, prepare and prepare too. In Costa Rica, I know that Diana talked about working with the National Emergency Commission, the Ministry of Housing, Municipality of San Jose, professional associations, again, universities, research institutes, CSOs, and others, really kind of speak to that multi-sector engagement. Number 4 is sharing in investments to save costs and reduce risk. So, some way you can look at this, back in 2017, we had the Mexico City Earthquake Response Program. There were really opportunities to formalize and strengthen public-private collaboration through the way in which we did surge capacity training for rapid damage assessments and detailed damage assessments. So that's a way to kind of share the burden. The fifth way is to increase the efficiency, cost effectiveness, and sustainability of donor efforts. So here donors are really looking for, they're making an investment in the program beyond the life of the program, so what? And so another example here from our work is, Prepare, Prepare to, and Beyond in Colombia. There's been a lot of scale and replication, demand creation and expansion of our work, targeted engagement and technical support that really shows the donor, in this case USAID BHA, how much their efforts are having impact, and the ability to build on their initial investment and scale it and replicate it shows a level of efficiency and sustainability. The sixth is to influence the behavior of the private sector themselves in complex environments and disaster response. So this is mostly on the disaster response side. And again, how we've been able to do this in our programming. I recall there was an earthquake in Pasto in 2018. Prepare Colombia did a lot of rapid damage assessments there and after action review. Also data and risk knowledge that we've used to support parts of business resilience, addressing gaps and technical capabilities like we have done in Trinidad and Tobago, for example. So the seventh and final kind of trend way that donors have been clustering this point is to facilitate and create an environment in which humanitarian actors and DRR actors can explore synergies with the private sector. So oftentimes it's not very clear where those linkages would be, where even the communication channels would be, when would these groups meet up? And so again, there are many examples of how we've done this in our work, but thinking about the Ecuador Building Resilience Program, there was a lot of interinstitutional cooperation between government, private sector, academia, associations, and of course, international engagement with INGOs and companies that were interested in that space as well. So those are sort of 7 framing areas across donor groups where we're seeing these themes emerge. One last point before I speak a bit about the work that we're doing in Indonesia, because that really is focused on private sector in the core. One of the most referenced frameworks in the space is this concept of creating shared value, which I'm sure you've heard about. So just to say a little bit about that. So it's a business concept that was first introduced in the Harvard Business Review. There was an article called Strategy and Society, the link between competitive advantage and corporate social responsibility. So this was around 2011. It was written by Michael Porter and Mark Kramer. And the article provided insights and relevant examples of companies that have developed deep links between their business strategies and this concept of social good. They since went on to expand that to really articulate how corporate social responsibility differs from this concept of creating shared value. So although they share the same general ground of, doing well by doing good, one of the major differences is that corporate social responsibility is about responsibility, whereas the other is really about creating value. So the central premise behind creating shared value is that the competitiveness of a company and the health of the communities around it are mutually dependent. So recognizing this and capitalizing on these connections between societal and economic progress, they argue, has the power to really unleash this next wave of growth and impact in the private sector. So there's a lot more to say here. And honestly, if you're interested in this space at all, it's an awesome article. And I would encourage you to read it. But crudely, if you picture a Venn diagram, it would look so the circles would be business opportunities and emerging business strategies in one circle. The second circle as social need and the room for innovation. And the third is organizational capabilities, so the company's assets and expertise. And so then the overlap in the middle would be the shared value space. That's sort of what they're talking about and trying to articulate. So you hear a lot of donors also talking about how do we create shared value programming as a way to engage the private sector more broadly. Okay, next slide, please. So let me speak a little bit now about the USAID Advance program, which is the program that's running in Indonesia. And let me cue it up a little bit with some context before I run through some of the programming components. So The problem statement here is that Indonesia remains one of the world's most natural disaster prone countries, and the government of Indonesia spends an estimated 300 to 500 million USD on post disaster reconstruction every year. And businesses themselves, most businesses, many businesses are just one disaster away from closure. And often, as we talk about, as we've heard, Kidd and others speak about in the past, the best thing that a business can do post disaster is to stay in business. And so the focus of the program really is on this upstream preparedness, risk reduction, and promoting greater resilience. Now, the reason that we've been able to get some traction here is the government of Indonesia and donors in this space increasingly are recognizing the importance of private sector in disaster preparedness and response and recovery. So, we are working here with USAID-DHA, which is very similar to a lot of the programs that we're doing around the world, and really driving home this idea that better data and understanding of risk, in this case, particularly earthquake risk, helps businesses prepare in a cost-effective way, and then they can also more effectively contribute to a humanitarian response, both in terms of their actions, but their ability to sort of stay in business. So we also have a piece of the program that looks at information sharing across public and private actors to improve access of knowledge and improve coordination, and this gets into a little bit of the disaster risk management side of things as well. But the program goal overall is to increase private sector disaster preparedness and involvement in disaster risk management. Ultimately, for this aim, as we do with a lot of BHA programs, to reduce lives lost, the people that would be injured, and the social and economic disruption from an earthquake. So let me just more queuing up before we go through some of the slides. So I will show a bit of diagrams on the program approach, but the important thing to recognize is that what we're trying to do here is a layered and iterative process, looking at kind of structural and non-structural parts of business resilience, linkages between the community side, hands-on action planning through some of the disaster imagination scenarios, and then sharing what has been learned through networks and engagement and knowledge exchange. One of the other things that I'll highlight is, luckily, we're working in Jakarta, targeting the Jakarta area. The Jakarta provincial government has just recently started working on an earthquake disaster contingency plan. And so we've been able to not just link directly through the program to that policy work, but also link the private sector businesses that we're working in into that dialogue. So that's been really great. And so this has been about not just USAID BHA, but the National Disaster Management Authority in Indonesia and the Regional Disaster Management Agency of the Jakarta area, which is our main target. So we can go to the next slide. So this is a pilot, and again, the main beneficiaries that we're working with here are private sector businesses. We have chosen those that are 8 stories and below in terms of their structure, because these are typically non-engineered structures in Indonesia and are very vulnerable. As such, also, this is a huge part of the building stock. And the other reason that we've chosen these sort of smaller to medium-sized enterprises is because a lot of the larger companies have resources to invest in either their business resilience work or business continuity plans, but these smaller businesses do not. And so this is why we're targeting this group. And so the businesses that participate in the program, they receive business resilience planning support, which includes knowledge exchanges, structural and non-structural mitigation recommendations, and this participation in scenario exercises. We're kind of queuing them up to see themselves as disaster risk reduction and preparedness champions in their community, really supporting information sharing across their community and with public actors. And I'll share a bit more about that later, but you can go to the next slide. So this is what I articulated in terms of the program approach. The steps are a little bit misleading because it's not sequential. We've been doing pieces of this work as the program has been implementing over the past year or so, but it's essentially these components, the linkages to the community risk profiles, the business resilience assessments, the scenario work, and then amplifying what we know through the different networks. So The core program objectives are really to advance disaster risk governance, and number 4 really speaks to that. Improve disaster planning and preparedness for these businesses, and that's a lot about the data. Data is a big part, and action planning is a big part of steps 1, 2, 3. And then the third kind of program objective is about local capacity. So this is public and private, but also to create this demand within the private sector themselves. Next slide. So this shows a little bit about how we're speaking to impact, how we're implementing that approach and model, which is a new approach and model for us, and we're continuing to refine as we go to achieve impact. So what are we trying to do with this program anyway? Well, we want the strengthened ability of the private sector to prepare for, respond to, and recover from earthquake disasters. We want their increased participation in disaster management. We want them to have the improved availability of earthquake and structural data for decision making. And we want to share what we know with those practical tools and frameworks across public and private actors to really support information exchange and learning. So you'll see all of the program approaches feeding into the core impact that we're trying to achieve in the Indonesia program. Next slide. I'll run through these pretty quickly, but the idea here is that we're trying to also pilot some innovative approaches and merging some ideas, and there have been members of the team who have been working on this as well, in addition to a consultant that we've been working with, Dave. So this idea of a neighborhood settlements approach is something that USAID has been really advancing in the shelter sector for a long period of time. And so we have overlaid that with this notion of business continuity planning and some other theoretical models. Next slide. Come to an idea of how we can look at business resilience more broadly. So not just the business itself, but also engaging the business more deeply in their neighborhood and understanding how elements in the neighborhood may affect the business and may be impacted by a disaster. So these core elements, the core concept, come from this USAID settlements approach, and we've been looking at merging these ideas, the business resilience, the settlements approach. Next slide. And so we're literally in the process. This is real time. We just had some really great discussions with USAID last month about putting this into a checklist. And then next slide. And really working it into an action plan that the business will have. So this is not a financial plan, it's not a business continuity plan, but it's the concept here is an action plan that the business would have for greater resilience, also understanding how they interact with their community. So going back to the program approach, we're providing the businesses all these data inputs, structural, non-structural, the community risk, so that they can come out with this action planning and understand where they can make decisions to make themselves more resilient and where they can really become DRR champions in this larger space. So with that, I will mention that we are moving on to wonderful presentations from Nicole, Victoria, and Olivia in that order. And then we'll be followed by some discussion. So with that, I will turn it over to Nicole. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the local experience with business, public sector, private sector engagement. But I'm going to make a reference to Elizabeth's presentation just now. Okay, so Lucian, can we go to the next slide? So in Trinidad and Tobago, disasters are considered a public issue because, of course, the vulnerable people get affected. And the government then steps in and what we call mattress and minister. Yeah, all the relief starts pouring out and so on. And Elizabeth's presentation was very interesting because for a change, they're viewing the vulnerable population as the business community. Because the business community tends not to look at themselves as a vulnerable population. They tend to think of the poor and the disability people and so on. But in Elizabeth's presentation, it made a very good point that the business community is vulnerable and they do need help. So they are part of the responsibility. Lucian, can we go on? So we were lucky in that the American Chamber of Commerce in Trinidad and Tobago had already signed on with the Arise initiative. I think it was serendipity because Sabine and Deanna and they arrived just at the time the UN people were pushing the Arise initiative, and everybody signed on at the same time. So having signed on, they had a commitment now to produce something. So they called on their subcommittee and they said, what shall we focus on? And they came up with a short list of 4 ideas from the different people in the subcommittee. The Trinidad Red Cross was working on early warning systems. Some of the members wanted to look at legislation like fire codes. And it comes back to Elizabeth's shared value, because those who were interested in fire codes were really selling fire equipment. And some were very interested in just getting risk information out to the public. Yeah? And in some instances, it was also kind of self-serving, because for the insurance industry, if they got risk information out, they would then have a better chance of selling their product. So those were the 4 areas they were interested in. Business tends to want to say that they're not focused on business, but in fact they are. So if you think like them, then we ask the question, well, what would they want and what would be beneficial to them? Lucia, next slide. And I don't blame them. The purpose of business is business. They're not there to be charitable. They're there to make money and grow their business. And in doing so, they can then generate largesse to other people. So the subcommittee had some criteria for how they would select what they were doing. And the 4 criteria essentially that it had to have a positive impact on small and medium enterprises. Perhaps they could get the financial sector involved in some way. Definitely they wanted the insurance industry involved. And to this day, they still want the insurance industry involved. And lastly, they were hoping to get some sort of resilient infrastructure because this affected their logistics. So they were trying to get some sort of advocacy for resilient infrastructure. In the end, Lucia, if we could go to the next slide. So in the end, they went with business continuity planning. Yay for us. And the reason was that COVID descended on us and everybody suddenly realized how vulnerable they were. So that was the first thing. Secondly, they needed to do something where they didn't have to get together. So they could do it online. Thirdly, what was beneficial to them was as a secretariat for multiple businesses, they could call on their larger businesses with dedicated departments to train or share knowledge with their smaller enterprises. And so they started a mentoring program within their secretariat. And lastly, the Secretariat AmJam decided they would provide 1 year support for anybody who attended the training in February, I believe it was, to continue with the program. Fortunately, they did such a good job. And when I say they, I mean the insurance, oil and gas companies, disaster management dedicated companies that did the training, that most of the people didn't want any mentoring subsequent to the training. So what happened next, Lucian? What happened next? Here's where we get to the hard part. How do they sustain momentum now that they've been off on a successful leap? Bearing in mind that COVID was still with us when we thought it would be gone by this year. So moving on, Lucia. So this was the challenge we had, that when we met to discuss what's next, what came out was, we don't want to spend a lot of time in meetings and discussions and planning. We want something small and tangible that we could fire off with. And what was really coming out in the discussion was, we want the return on our investment in time or money. Otherwise, the businesses who are already crippled by the COVID economic market would tend not to want to get involved. It's like any committee where you ask for volunteers, people tend not to want to volunteer and you always get the same group of people. Well, even the Chamber of Commerce had that problem with the same group of people stepping forward and the majority just sitting back and hoping to get benefits. So to get their attention, I realized that we have to try to find some way where there is some kind of return on their investment. And by that, I give you 4 areas. That return on investment has to be something that helps them expand their market, I think it is Victoria is going to talk about public-private partnerships that help expand markets. Maybe it's going to be something that will boost their reputation and their brand. Nestle, for example, uses their product in a lot of DRM programs in Africa. But what they get from it is the visibility of their product and their brand recognition. So they don't mind giving away because they know they will get value back. The insurance companies like Munich Re and Zurich Re, all the, what do you call them? The name escapes me right now. They want to expand their market. So they're even looking at microfinancing. So they're funding projects that help get them exposure to the community because they realize what they call the base of the pyramid is an expanding market. They've already exhausted all the developed countries. They need new markets. There's also the cost savings thing they're looking at in all these DRM programs. So for example, if a hotel works with a community in agriculture to protect their products, they get a reliable supply and the community gets a market to sell their product to. So there's a shared value. So it's stuff like that that we're trying to explore and see where we might find a common ground to go forward in. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to, I think it's Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Fabulous. Yes, Victoria, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Yes, you guys.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, so I will continue with private sector engagement and response. So next, please. As you may have heard or know, we have three main objectives in Prepare Mexico, which we are implementing in 3 different municipalities. 2 municipalities in the state of Mexico City and 1 municipality in the state of Jalisco. So our first objective is to the creation of damage assessment protocols and procedures and debris disposal. This is happening in the 3 municipalities, let's say the 2 of Mexico City and the one in Jalisco. The second objective is strengthen public-private collaboration. So actually, this is done between universities and businesses. At least that's how our technical proposal has established, that we will be doing this private collaboration both with the universities, which is creating an RDA curricula for students of architecture and civil engineering the last semesters, but also we have this part of including private sector or businesses. This is happening also in the 3 different locations that we have. And then we have the third objective, which is the basic, the seismic resistant construction techniques. We will do some trainings for auto construction and masons. And this is only happening in Zapopan in the state of Jalisco. So even though we can have some public-private engagement with this third objective, definitely the core of our work will be done under the second objective. So next slide, please. This is the objective where I will be focusing on, and is the strengthening of public-private collaboration, specifically in risk management and response tools. So in the indicator that we have that we have in our technical proposal and that we have to achieve is that we need to have a number of private sector businesses directly engaged in response or DRR related activities as a result of the program. We need to have 6, and I know it can sound like a easy and small number, but to be honest, it is a challenge. It is a big challenge to engage the private sector in the response or in the disaster risk reduction related activities, because first of all, I will go deeper into this in the next slides, but first of all, we are only in 3 municipalities, right? So it's not something national that can give them this huge, awareness and brand awareness, of course, and can help them achieve their internal goals. So we have been presented with many challenges that, next slide, please, that I have kind of drafted into four big problems, let's say. The first one is that the private sector is huge. We have around 4.9 million legal businesses in Mexico. So if you say, well, you need to only choose 6, it sounds like an easy task. But the truth is that you can get lost between these millions and millions of businesses. And then how do you choose them? How do you contact them? How do you know which ones are actually interested and which ones can actually bring something to the table when you have so many? Then from the construction sector, of course, we have millions too. This will be a way to narrow it down, but we still have millions. So this was the first problem. The second was that the private sector is not very involved in DRR. As Nicole was mentioning, it is also seen here as a public matter, as something that the government should be dealing with and worrying about. It's not really something that the companies are very much interested in. So convincing them that they need to be involved and that they are a key actor in the process would take probably a lot of time and resources that we don't really have, right? We have a deadline and we have an indicator to achieve. So this was another kind of a problem that we faced. The third one, as I mentioned before, is that our objectives are very localized. There are 3 municipalities that are important ones, of course, and that will definitely have an impact on the state and eventually on a national level. We need to start local. But for huge companies, for big companies, this is not very attractive. And then if we reach out to the smaller companies, they don't really have, kind of the resources and the people and the human capital to be able to invest in this extra activity. And the fourth one, as I mentioned, this is a kind of a joint objective with the universities. Private universities were really slow in showing interest in our program. Right now, we have a number of them, but when we were in the planning phase, they were really slow. They were not very sure. They expressed interest, but were taking things with caution. So we really couldn't rely on them to know that this will actually be happening, even though we were considering both private universities from Jalisco and from Mexico City. So this is basically the problem we were facing here in Mexico as Prepare Mexico. Next slide, please. And this is the solutions we thought, actually the solution we thought about. So the first one will be, instead of them coming to us, we went to them, in terms of, instead of trying to just create a awareness about the program and just waiting for them to approach us, we decided that it was better that we should go to them, even if it was a huge space to get into ourselves. We decided it was better to just jump into it. So the second one, we did create awareness, but in the companies that are already involved in disaster risk reduction. So it was not worth it to create the interest, but better to approach those that already have an interest in this matter. And this was through the ARISE network. ARISE is the Private Sector Alliance for Disaster Resilient Societies, which is led by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. I'm sure some of you or all of you may be familiar with this. So we approached ARISE, we expressed our interest in participate with them and create something together. They were very happy that we approached them. They already knew about the company. Dr. Kit Miyamoto actually was at a forum here in Mexico City giving a conference at a panel. He was part of a panel of ARISE Mexico annual event back when we were able to do face-to-face events. So he participated, and of course he was a great panelist, and this created a very good image of us, of the company, in front of ARISE Mexico. So once we approached, they already knew who we were, and they were happy to do some collaboration together. But the idea was to connect local disaster risk reduction government institutions with ARISE. So the program would actually serve as a bridge, right? As a bridge between this private sector that is already interested in DRR and the institutions, the government that is actually making it happen, responding to the emergencies. So what we thought of is take advantage of the past efforts that have already been done and improve them, kind of thinking of capacity building and thinking about this initial mandate of strengthen the public-private collaboration, right? How to make it better, how to make it stronger, and how to make them collaborate together. So we thought of planning bigger, not local, not only with these 3 municipalities that we are targeting, but think about it as a state or even as a national level to kind of get their interest. Of course, the local 3 municipalities will be definitely involved, but we are also then bringing them to the next level, right? To the arena where they will be able to interact at the state level and at a federal level. And finally, our solution then was to co-organize the 5th national meeting on disaster risk reduction and major emergency management. It will be co-organized between ARISE, between the program and the government institutions that are responding to emergencies, the first responders, civil protection, the user groups, and all of this government sector that is normally acting on their own. And then we have ARISE that is normally acting on their own. And what we will try to do is to create this bridge and do one thing while everybody is involved. We will, our idea is to have a stage where the private sector can share with the local governments what they do and how do they participate in these processes. And also, of course, have this feedback on how they could engage better with the government. So this is what we are thinking about. It was scheduled to happen in September. It's an event, a conference that has happened before. As you can see, this will be the 5th one. They normally have around 800 and 1,000 participants. So because of the rise of COVID, we decided we will postpone a bit until things get better. We are on our 4th wave, I believe, right here, right now in Mexico. So things are going up very quickly. So we rather wait since it's a big number of people that we are planning on having. But well, this is what we are thinking of, and hopefully it will help to get them started, right? Probably the 6th, 7th, or 10th national meeting. I don't know if Prepare will be involved, but what I do know is that this relations between the public and the private sector will already be there. So that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Excellent. Before I turn it over to Callie to talk a little bit about the housing side, just to note, for those who are not aware, you know, as we talked about the evolving trends in the beginning, these partner forums and opportunities to influence and dialogue and exchange have also emerged. So there's 2 big ones. The Connecting Business Initiative, which is led by UN OCHA and UNDP, started around 2016. And ARISE, that Victoria talked about with UNDRR in the lead, started around 2015. So they're also finding their way. They tend to be organized by national networks. They obviously have home office support, pushing information in various ways, but really the activity is at the national level. Some countries have both CBI and ARISE acting in countries. Some countries have one or the other, but these are really emerging places where we can influence the dialogue and be present. So thank you for raising that. Okay, Callie, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone. As you mentioned too, Olivia would like to be here, but I'm going to present for us both. Since Olivia has come on board in the last 1.5 years, we've really been able to increase our capacity on the housing front. And as housing finance and affordable housing and everything else is at the forefront of the development agenda, it's a really pertinent topic. And especially as urbanization continues to increase, more and more people seek formal housing. The housing sector will play a bigger role in economic stimulus, the resilience agenda, and everything else. And the private sector plays a huge role on both the supply and demand side of that. So with that, next slide, please. So just to start off, people often think about housing deficits and solving the housing crises as kind of more of the quantitative housing deficit side. So we need more homes. There's homeless people, there's people in informal settlements, we need homes. But there's two different ways to look at it. One is that quantitative housing deficit. The other is the qualitative housing deficit. A lot of people necessarily don't want a new home. They want a better home. They want the extra kitchen. They want, their floors repaired. They want a retrofit. So kind of framing as well the housing sector between those two lenses. And then the next slide, we'll talk about how to address both the supply and demand with how the private sector and the government play a critical role in both. So next slide, please. So one of the things that I found most fascinating when I was first getting into this is like the idea that housing is a manufactured product. It doesn't just come out of thin air, the mortgages, everything that goes into it is manufactured, and it's quite a complex process between balancing the demand and the supply when thinking about housing. They're very, very connected. If you only look at one, and I see now that the supply is doubled on here, Lucienne. Sorry about that. So usually, would have the demand and the supply is separate. I can kind of walk through what would be under the supply side, but the demand is more like on the housing finance. And a lot of that comes from the government. So the private sector can do a lot in the housing sector, but the government also has to enable that. So for example, if there's a great number of, if there's no formal income, then banks can't underwrite income to then give people a loan. Or if there's no foreclosure laws, banks assume that, if you give someone a mortgage and they default on it, what ramifications are there for the bank to then recoup their losses? So as Elizabeth was talking about earlier as well, this kind of balancing and sharing of risk. Oh, thank you. That is a key part of kind of balancing as well, this demand and supply between the housing finance and the constructions of homes. So again, back to that kind of quantitative housing deficit, when we think, a lot of times people talk about like the construction costs and how if we could just reduce construction costs, reduce the cost of materials and labor and everything else, that will help the housing deficit. But really you need to look at it as like this very complex manufactured product where, perhaps it's the land that's actually going to cost more. So land costs can vary. Something that you build in Manhattan, that's going to be quite a bit more expensive than, a house in Iowa. So looking at all the various aspects of, what infrastructure is in there, is there already electricity and sewage? And so having this kind of balance and between what the government can do, and then also that enables what the private sector can do to support housing finance and the housing sector. Next. So as I said, there's a couple ideas for interventions that the government can do to, again, enable the private sector. Some small changes can have a really big impact. So for example, something that Olivia's worked on a lot is this idea of the condominium law. She's been working on it in Haiti for quite a few years. And this is the idea that you can write stratified land titles. So it takes a lot of changing the land registry, training, and kind of a switch in your mind of you can own land in 3D. So for example, in Haiti right now, again, where she did a lot of this work, you can only own land horizontally, not vertically. So of course, a developer then would be not as much inclined to build up, which is required in a lot of urban spaces these days. There's a sort of the land, you build up, but if someone can't own that home or own a title to it, there's not a lot of incentive to then build up. I already mentioned kind of the foreclosure laws as well. Another small thing that they can do, it says small changes, but of course these public-private partnerships are pretty large scale, but that is another type of impact that the government can have with the private sector to support the housing sector. Next slide. So on the role of these public-private partnerships, one of the projects that we're doing is helping the IFC and the government of East Timor to develop a public-private partnership for affordable housing in East Timor. The overall goal of the project is to optimize this partnership between a private party and the government. So we're trying to make a PPP model for affordable and mixed income housing that is attractive for a variety of organizations within the private sector. For example, local banks. Right now, there are no mortgages in East Timor. So there's issues with land titles, there's issues with income levels, and right now, as we talk to these banks, I think they've talked to about 5 banks thus far. No one really offers mortgages, but they would be interested in doing so. So it's about learning what they would need to see in order to provide these mortgages and different financing options, and also learning what they've done thus far and how we can kind of get creative with these various financing options to get people into these homes. There's also conversations with foreign developers and investors, again, understanding the policies and the laws of the country and how to attract foreign developers and investors. And a lot of times too, for these PPPs, that then means that while the goal for the government is to offer affordable housing, there was actually a big flood near this site, which is about 5 to 7 kilometers from the capital of Dili. There was flooding that happened back in April, and they really want to offer this housing for flood victims. But for a PPP to be successful, there has to be, again, that shared risk and also have it be attractive to foreign developers. So this project that we are proposing, this model is going to be mixed income with low, medium, and high income housing. And, interviewing the people, understanding the cultures, the cultural sensitivities, the politics, what infrastructure is there, what's needed from the government, the land titles, this very complex kind of organism comes together. And that's what we're doing to support, again, the government of Timor and the IFC to create this PPP model. So as a private sector firm, we're advising on how to include these various private sector organizations in this large scale housing development. So that is it from me. I think last slide is perhaps a little bit of a discussion, but thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Callie. So indeed, we started a few minutes late. We're coming up on the hour. Maybe we have 10 minutes here if people can stay on. These are some prompter questions, but we don't need to go through these. I mean, really would like to know what questions are around the table. We covered a lot of ground here, from Mexico to Trinidad, Tobago, to more on the sector side, looking at housing, deep dive. What's resonating with you? Is there anything here that you want to discuss further, either in your own countries and programs, or questions that have come up that you want to think more about? So let me pause there and see if anybody wants to either raise their hand or just jump in. Maybe just a general reaction question. Is there anything here that surprised you, or anything that was new information that you learned about how Miyamoto's engaged in this space that you didn't know before? Or, these opportunities are so great for just knowledge sharing across the organization. Any reactions, any just initial thoughts that people had?
I'll share, Elizabeth. I'm a bit more familiar with the Prepare project, so I just want to say thank you to Callie for highlighting some of the housing work. I don't always touch that, and also don't know that much about the sector. So those slides were really enlightening for me. So thank you.
Hopefully you'll hear more about it in the coming months. It is a really interesting project. Happy to share any more materials on it. Sam and Olivia and I are in the weeds on it now, and it's such an exciting project. And I think we're encountering as well a lot of the challenges that are across the board for the housing sector, in particular like land titles. That's like the #1 question on every call is like, is there a title? Is there a title? And it's something like I don't often think about. But yeah, it's a really interesting project. So as we continue along, happy to share more information on it. We just got our session report improved and are moving things forward with our partners. So that's that. I think one of my thoughts too on like just the whole private sector engagement, I think, the fact that Miyamoto International is a for-profit firm in this space gives us quite like, not a justification, but like, I think we're a very prominent voice in this space. And as we're doing this pilot in Indonesia that is becoming so successful, leading to more works, and the Prepare grows and grows and grows. I just think it's a really, it's a very prominent position that we've made for ourselves. And it's very exciting that we are becoming kind of the leaders in this space and adapting so well to all the various challenges that we've encountered thus far. So I think that was kind of my takeaway, especially here in Victoria with the problems and the solutions. I just think it's a really impressive team, and the adaptability is impressive and is needed for the private sector. I think it's something that we also then show to the people that we're working with. So Ghislaine, over to you.
Ghislaine, yeah.
Well, I was very interested in finding out with Nicole about the Hamsham team that they have and the work that's going to be done, and maybe we could use that in Haiti. Also, I wasn't aware of the Arise and the other entities that are working with private sector and everything else. I think a lot of expertise and experience that you are developing right now can be used in Haiti. One of the things I wanted to add for Calais and Olivia, there was a legislation about vertical, and people now can buy and own an apartment on a vertical building. Legislation has passed about several years ago, and I'll gladly pass it on to you guys. But this was very interesting. It's a lot of information. I found myself in Mexico looking at a lot of things that we've done that were not easy tasks. And I understand how difficult it is with you guys right now. But it's possible. And if you want some ideas or anything, like I had discussed with Nicole and anybody else, feel free to call and shoot an email. I'll gladly share my experience and how we managed to work around the blockage of the private sector and public sector. It was very difficult to put these two together at one table. But Nicole, I need to get back to you with the Hamsham. I want to see how it's done in Trinidad, because I think I'm a member of several of those commissions in Hamsham in Haiti, and they've been looking in how to get those people together. Miyamoto had started doing some work with the insurance in Haiti. It didn't take very much because they didn't see what was in it for them. But I think now may be a good time to start again and make them forget about other things happening in the country. Thank you, guys.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great linkages across. I don't know if I'm not seeing anybody else raise their hands. I also know that people have other time commitments, so I don't want to keep us if there aren't any further areas for discussion or question. Maybe I'll move to sort of summarize kind of the key points here. There's been a lot of programmatic development in this engagement of private sector, both in terms of how we've approached it in the USAID work and with other donors, but also how we've engaged in the broader community in terms of positioning Miyamoto as a key thought leader and partner in this private sector engagement space. And we've heard a lot of examples of different ways to do that from Trinidad and Tobago, from Mexico and others. Deeper dive on the housing side. As Ghislaine just mentioned, there are a lot of opportunities for cross-learning and linkages across countries. And this is an evolving space. So I guess my final message on my side is, as we're watching the donor funding, we are not seeing at this very moment kind of robust funding streams that are just private sector engagement focused. However, there are innovative mechanisms that, for example, USAID are looking to pilot, and there are always program components where looking at private sector is welcomed by a lot of donors. But I do feel that as we move forward, this agenda is going to gain more and more prominence. So the more experience that we have in this space, the more that we do in this space, I think better positions us to continue to be in a leadership role. So definitely a space to watch as time goes on. And thank you all for your contributions to Nicole, Victoria, and Callie. Thank you to Lucienne and others for setting up this great discussion. I think that's it in terms of closing remarks from my side. Lucienne, maybe over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. No, that's it from me as well. So thank you everyone for participating.
Final thoughts from around the table before we go? Going once.
Just a big thank you to everyone that presented. Like Ghislaine said, there's a lot of information and a lot of useful information. I learned a lot, so thank you very much.
Yeah, and thank you for Nicole. We had a very interesting discussion some weeks ago about how to move forward on this. I would definitely would love to discuss this with some other countries and some other cities that have gone through the process, because it would definitely help me a lot. So I will be reaching out. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, with that, everybody stay safe and healthy. Until next time.